All right, folks, I've put together this entire HTML crash course video. It's over 2 hours in content. And what I've done is I recorded these videos quite some time ago and I uploaded them to YouTube in just little small 5-minute chunks. And they're a little bit hard to follow in sequence in the playlist. So I've compiled all those down to a giant one, I think it's 2.5 hours roughly video. And don't forget to check down in the description because I'll have little jump links to every single section of the HTML content as the video flows. So please like and subscribe and share this content. I hope you learned something. Towards the end of this video, I'll also give a few additional resources where you can go from there to do more advanced things with your HTML. So I hope you like it, and we will see you in the next one. Welcome to the HTML and CSS series from websitedesigncourse.net. In this series, we'll be covering HTML and CSS. The series will be broken down into two major sections. The first series of videos will cover HTML and CSS basics, and the second half, or the second series of videos, will be coding up the project we designed in the previous series. So we'll be building the HTML and CSS for our website. So first, we'll kind of cover the basics and generalities of HTML and CSS, and then we'll move into the actual project where we code a real live example. Now, just to quickly show you what HTML and CSS looks like, you can see the source code of any website on the internet by simply right-clicking. If you just find a blank area on a web page and right-click, depending on which browser you're in, it'll say show page source or view source or something similar. You can choose this show page source and it will bring up the source code. Now, source code is processed in the browser natively, so it's freely available for anyone to view and to dissect and to see exactly how a website was built. You can see here's all the HTML for this particular website. And we can scroll down clear to the bottom. You can see there's several tags. If this is your first time looking at HTML, it may look a little daunting at first. But once we cover the basics, you'll realize that HTML is fairly simple, and it's just a simple structured language. It's just a little bit of memorization, and then you'll be fairly comfortable with reading through this source code. Now, this is the HTML. I'll peek inside one of these CSS files so you can get an idea of what the CSS looks like. So I'll click on this CSS file right here. Now, this particular file is the CSS, and you can see it looks quite a bit different than HTML. It has a little bit different syntax, and this is the syntax for CSS. And CSS files can get quite large. You can see this particular CSS file goes clear down to looks like just over 1,000 lines of CSS. So that is not uncommon. The HTML is probably not that many lines. If we go back here and actually look at the HTML, it's about 200 lines roughly. So CSS typically is longer lines, but HTML typically has more content because there's a lot more code inside of an HTML file than there is in a CSS file horizontally. All right, so get ready. We'll start off with the basics of CSS, and I hope you enjoy this series. All right, this series is going to cover the difference between HTML and CSS. And we're going to look at the structure and the syntax of each of these two languages separately. We'll briefly discuss the difference between HTML and CSS to get started. Now, HTML is responsible for the structure and the content of a web page, while CSS is responsible for the style attributes and the visual components of a website. So you can kind of think of HTML as the skeleton and CSS as the skin and the makeup and the hair and whatnot. So they each play an important role in web design, and we'll cover each one of these separately. First, we're going to start out with HTML and talk about the specifics of how HTML looks and its role in web design. So HTML has a very simple syntax. This entire line here you see is what we call a tag. A tag is made up of first a tag name. In this case, the tag name is H1. H1 refers to a header tag, or a heading tag rather. So a heading 1 tag is the largest and the main heading of a website. It's usually at the top of a website, or the title of the article or something similar to that would be where a heading 1 tag would be used. Now, tags can have attributes and values. Some tags require attributes and values, and other tags, they're optional. But the attribute is before the equal sign, and the value comes after the equal sign. You can see how the value is in quotation marks. You can have multiple pairs of attributes and values in one particular tag. Now this entire opening line is what we call the opening tag. So I would reference this as the opening header1 tag or the opening h1 tag. And you can see that tags always have these opening angle brackets and a closing angle bracket on either side of the tag. Some people call those chevrons. I just refer to them as angle brackets. All right, the content of the tag is just simply referred to as the tag content. It's the visual aspect of the tag. Whatever is inside of the tag content is what will show up visually actually on the web page. So your users will see that. The last portion here is what we call the closing tag. So you can notice the closing tag has a / before the tag name. And that's the basic syntax of HTML tags. Once we get into a few code examples, we'll walk through this again slowly so you can kind of get a comfortable idea of how these tags work. Now, a typical tag is structured inside of an HTML page as you see here. This particular tag is a UL tag. UL stands for unordered list. And basically this will create a bulleted list. And you can see that the UL tag is what we call a parent tag. Now the parent tag means that that tag opens and closes and there's children inside of that tag. So these three tags inside of it, which are LI tags, you can see there's list item 1, list item 2, and list item 3. Those are all child tags. And a general rule of thumb when you're building HTML structure, that every time you have a child tag, meaning a tag inside of a parent, you would indent that over one tab space from where the parent tag starts. And this may seem a little confusing at first, but it'll become really natural once you start coding and once you start programming your web page through HTML. It's quite a natural process. So don't get too caught up in this right now. Again, we'll look at this when we get into our code examples. But I just wanted you to be familiar with the terminology parent tag and child tag. Now you could say that list item is a child of UL or unordered list. And you could also say UL is a parent of list item. Now this particular slide has 1/3 hierarchy. It has a header1 tag that's a child of list item as well. And list item could be a parent of header1. Or you could even say header1 is a grandchild of UL. Now usually you don't use grandchild or grandparent, you just stick with parent and child relationships. I put in the third header1 tag just so you can see that every time you have a child tag of a parent tag, you indent it over one tab on your keyboard. So this is typically how you'll see a web page structured. This isn't actually requisite to build a web page. You don't have to tab that over, as web pages will read the source code with tabs, with spaces, without spaces, with tabs. It's really just for human readability purposes. It makes your code a lot easier to troubleshoot, to program, and to update. So you're doing yourself a favor by including these tabs as you program your HTML. A lot of code editors that you write code in, like Dreamweaver or TextMate or Sublime Text, a lot of these popular ones, they'll do this automatically for you as you build your code. All right, so here's just a simple example of what some HTML source would look like. This is a similar example to the previous slide. On the left, we have our unordered list that has 3 list items. And visually on the right is what it would look like on a web page. The code on the left produces a bulleted list with 3 list items. And you can see that very top item has an attribute and a value. And it's making that specific item 1 list item visually different than the rest. In this case, it appears orange, but again, CSS would be responsible for styling that item orange or attaching any of the visual aspects to the element. So it's just a quick example to show you how that might look. Now, HTML tags fall into 2 broad classifications, and they are block or inline tags. Block tags are things like the header tag, the footer tag, article. You can see a simple list there of 10 or so different tags. You can see the header1 tag is an example of a block tag. Inline tags on the right are things such as span, anchor tags, image tags, strong emphasis. So we'll quickly discuss the difference between a block tag and an inline tag. And this kind of trips people up, I think, when they start out at HTML just a little bit. So first off, the block tag means that when you declare the tag, so if I was to do, let's say, a header tag in my HTML, let's assume that this gray box represents the browser window. So this is visually what I see in my web browser. If I did one header tag, it would fill up the entire width of the browser window. If I followed up directly below with another header tag, it appears below that header tag. And if I did another header tag, it would appear below that one. In other words, block level elements take up an entire line of horizontal space in the browser window, regardless of their width. You can see even if the width of 2 or 3 of these elements is short, they still take up the entire line. And that's opposed to inline tags, whereas if you do an inline tag, the same example here, let's pretend this is the browser window. If you do, let's say, an anchor tag, it would appear, and if I did another anchor tag directly after it, instead of it appearing down on a new line, it appears to the side or in line to the other anchor tag. So inline elements will all appear on the same horizontal line until they run out of room, and then they would pop down to the next line. But that's the main difference between an inline tag and a block tag as far as their visual representations. There's a few other differences as well that we'll get into in the later series in this course. Now that's the basics of the tags and their classifications. Now let's quickly look at the typical structure of an HTML document. So an HTML document is made up of 3 main portions, and we'll quickly look at those. So this is a complete website. This code here that you see is a complete website, valid with all of the required parts. The first line here you'll see is what we call the doc type or the document type. This declares what type of HTML your website is using, what version of HTML, and some other information is conveyed to the web browser through the doc type. It's always the very first line in your document. The next line here is the HTML tags. It's always the second item and the very last item. So you can see that the tag HTML, in all of your website code, is encompassed inside of the HTML tag. It's the parent-most tag for your HTML document. The next section is what we call the head section. Now the head section, you can see, opens on line 3, and it has 2 children inside of it. And the head tag is responsible for website metadata. So it's typically information that's not visually displayed on the page, but information about the page, such as the title or the character set or JavaScript files that are linked to it and CSS files that are linked to it and keywords and descriptions and things like that, author information, all that type of data that's not visual data, but helps structure the web page is inside of the head section. The third and probably most important section for us starting out is the body section. The body section is what's responsible for everything that's visually present on the website. So the majority of your code will likely go inside of the body section because that's responsible for the visual layout. So everything inside of the body will appear inside of the browser window. And those are the main sections of a HTML document. Again, we have the doc type, first line, HTML tags, and the head and body sections. All right, now that we have a few of those basics out of the road, let's go ahead and look at a few code examples to review some of these principles for HTML syntax. All right, before we get into the code portion of this and look at some examples, you'll need to download a text editor in order to create some HTML. Now, there are many free text editors on the web that you can download to get started. I'm on a Macintosh computer, and I'm going to be using this program called TextMate. This is free. You can download TextMate. This is the program that I'll be using. If you're on a PC, I would recommend you start out with the program called Notepad++. So this program right here is a great free program to get you started editing and writing HTML in Notepad++. There's many other alternatives. There's on the Mac, there's Coda, we have Sublime Text, there's Dreamweaver. So there's several options. Look down in the project notes and I'll have the links to several of the text editors to get you started writing some code. All right, once you have your text editor downloaded and installed, go ahead and launch it up and let's create some code. You can, in theory, just use Notepad on a Windows or Text Edit on a Macintosh to write HTML code. HTML code is nothing more than text. So any text editor, anything that'll write text, you can actually create web pages and write web pages. You don't need to buy any proprietary programs to code for the web. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, I'll delete this first line. We're just going to start from scratch. I want to build this straight from scratch to give you an idea of the code for a web page. So I've created a new document here, and I'm just going to save this document. So I'll say File, Save. And I'm going to name this document index.html, and I'm just going to save it onto my desktop. I recommend you probably create a folder somewhere and store your index.html file inside of that folder to keep things organized. But I'm going to keep mine on my desktop for now just to keep things easier to locate. So I've called this document index.html for a reason. Index.html is typically the name of the home page of your website. So web browsers will automatically pull up this file when somebody types in your domain name.com. So almost always your main page of your site will be called index lowercase.html. So go ahead and save that document and let's create our first web page. Now we're going to be referencing the same syntax we used over inside of this PowerPoint slide to show you the HTML document structure. So again, the first line is the doc type. And the doc type starts with an angle bracket. That's the shift comma and shift period. You'll be using these quite often. And you can see the program I'm using, as soon as I insert the opening angle bracket, it automatically inserted this second one for me. So different text editors will have what they call code completion, which will help you write HTML code a little bit faster. They kind of guess at what you're going to be typing next and automatically insert that. So your program may or may not have that feature. If it doesn't, you'll have to type that yourself. So inside of here, we have an exclamation point, and then all in capital letters, doc type, and then space, and then in lowercase, HTML. And you can look over here from this example in the PowerPoint slide. That first line there is the doc type. This happens to be the HTML5 doc type, and we'll be using HTML5 throughout this tutorial. But if you want to use the XHTML doc type or any of these other doc types, I'll quickly show you what those look like. HTML5 doc type is much cleaner. The other doc types, let me go ahead and insert the HTML doc type here. And we'll insert doc type. Let's do the 4.01 transitional. This is the doc type. You can see it's quite a bit more messy for HTML4, and the XHTML doc type is also very similar to this. So you can see how it's quite a bit cleaner using the HTML5 doc type, which is why we'll stick with that. But if your project requires HTML4 code, then you'll want to use the HTML4 doc type. Now, after the doc type comes our first HTML tag. You can see back here from the project, we have an HTML, and this HTML tag has an attribute and a value. Lang equals EN. EN stands for English. So let's go ahead and type that out. So open the angle bracket, type HTML, and then lang equals EN. Notice the double quotes there. Now, another feature of this particular program I'm using is what we call syntax highlighting. You'll notice that this is in gray, and this property is in green, kind of a green color, and these are in this brown color. Most code editors feature this syntax highlighting. So different HTML attributes and tags and codes will appear as different colors in your markup code. And that's just to make it easier on the programmer to visually target into different attributes and values rather than having everything just a simple color. So it makes your code much more readable. All right, inside of that HTML tag, you'll notice that it closes down here. So I always recommend people when they're starting out, whenever you open an HTML tag, you must close it. That's one of the rules of XHTML is all tags that are opened, here's the opening tag, must be closed. There's the closing tag. So you can't ever have just an HTML tag without a closing tag. Make sure that if you ever open one, just get in the habit of closing it immediately. And then you come inside of the tag and one tab space over because we're going to be building the head section next. So we'll say head, and I'll tab that over. And I open the tag, and so I come down here and I close the tag. You can see my program automatically put it right there. So there's my head section. And while we're at it, let's add the body section. So add the body tag, open the body tag, and close the body tag. So the HTML is the parent, head is the child, body is a child, and you could say that body and head are siblings because they're both children of the HTML tag. Remember, that's why we did one tab space over. So get in that habit. And I'm going to save my document to make sure my program happened to crash. I don't lose all that work. So let's come back into the head section because there's a few things we need to add in here. The first one is called this meta tag. And this determines, or sets rather, the character set for my web page, which we're going to set to UTF-8. So let's add that. Come up inside of here and tab over. And we'll say meta charset equals UTF-8, like so. And that looks good. Now let's come back over here. You can see there's one more, which is the title. So we're going to add the title next. And so we're going to say title. And this is my new page. And then we close the title tag. So we open the title tag and we close the title tag. Now notice we opened the meta tag, but we didn't close the meta tag. And that's because the meta tag is what we call a self-closing tag. It doesn't have a close meta. There's really no such thing. But to satisfy the rules of XHTML, all tags that are opened must close. So we simply put a slash in front of the closing angle bracket on the opening tag, and that satisfies that rule. So this is called a self-closing tag. Some tags like the image tag and input tags for forms, web forms, they're all self-closing like this. Most of the HTML tags, however, have an opening declaration and a closing declaration both. So kind of be aware of that. There's a few nuances there. So the title tag, we've got that in place. We're going to look and see what that does in just 1 second. Let's go back and finish off this page. So we have our header 1 tag. We looked at this tag earlier. Remember, it creates a page heading. So we'll come down inside of our body section, make sure that we're tabbed over one space because header 1 is a child of body. And we'll type H1, and this is the heading. We'll close the header 1. And the next tag below this, we'll just do a paragraph tag. P stands for paragraph. This is the paragraph of the website following the heading. And then we'll close that paragraph tag. And notice that ran down onto the second line, but that's just fine. So we have an opening paragraph, opening heading, closing heading. And this page is now complete. So I'm going to save this page. And now we can preview this page in the web browser. So we'll jump back to our Finder window. And here's my HTML page. You'll recall I saved mine on my desktop. Now, depending on what operating system you're on, if you're on Windows 7 or OS 10, OS X, Macintosh, this will behave differently. So what you want to do is you want to right-click this and say Open With, and then pick a web browser out of the list. You may have Internet Explorer, Firefox, or Safari, or Google Chrome, Opera. Any of the web browsers will work just fine. So choose a web browser, and this will open up your newly created web page inside of a web browser. And you can see here is the header tag. So this is the heading, and here is the paragraph. And you'll notice the very top up here, up in the title bar, it says this is my new page. So this again came from that title. This is from the title, which is up in the head section. Now the title tag is very important. The title tag is what will appear as the blue links inside of Google. So if I go back and type text editor again, I'll just do a quick Google search here. All of this text that's blue, the big links inside of Google, this is what the titles are for these particular websites. So it's very important that you come up with a title that's unique to your website and uniquely describes the content on it. You have a much higher chance of getting your website clicked on inside of the Google page results if your title is relevant and catchy, I guess you could say. So don't just put a title like I've done here. This is a bad title. You would want to put a title that's relevant to your content. Like maybe I sell snowboards. So snowboards or whatever your websites would be about, right? So, all right, now back here to our web page. I'm going to show you how you view the source code again. So if we right click inside of here and we say show page source, this shows the source code. So again, this should exactly match the source code that I've typed in to my web page here. It's just a one-to-one copy. The source code makes up the structure. This is the HTML and the structure of the web page, and this is how it's visually displayed inside of the web browser. So now we've completed really our first web page. We'll get a little bit more complex and start introducing several more tags into your repertoire. All right, in this video tutorial, we're going to introduce several new tags and talk about the block versus inline and reference that again. Now, I have a simple page with the header 1 tag and a paragraph tag, and I'm going to introduce a new paragraph after this paragraph. So I'll just do a new paragraph tag. This is the second paragraph, and I'll close that paragraph tag and save. And I'm going to come back to my browser and refresh. Now you can just press the refresh button here. If you're on a Macintosh, you can press Command R, which refreshes the page. If you're on a PC computer, it's usually F5 will refresh the web page. And so once you refresh the web page, it just reloads the contents that you just edited. So I made a change. You save, Command S to save or file save, come back to your web browser and refresh, Command R, and that will load those changes. So you can see that change just popped up here. I've got my second paragraph in my website. And notice that the paragraph didn't appear to the left here. It appeared below the other paragraph. What this tells me is that the paragraph is a block tag because it's occupying this entire line all the way across the web browser. And this paragraph is occupying this entire line. And the heading, in fact, is occupying this entire line all the way across, even though the text is only this big. All three of these tags, the two paragraph tags and the heading tags, are block level tags, which is why they appear below the other tag. Now we'll look at an example of an inline tag to illustrate how those differ. So on this particular paragraph, I'm going to add an inline tag directly to this word paragraph. I'm going to add the strong tag. So I open strong before paragraph, and after paragraph, I'm going to close strong. And strong simply adds a bold type face by default to the contents here. So I'm going to save that, Command S, switch to my browser, Command R to refresh, or F5. And you can see now that word is bold. Now I know this is an inline tag because it didn't force that word down on a new line. If this was a block level tag, it would have appeared down on its own line, but instead it's inline, so it just applied the effect directly to this same line. It didn't alter the flow of the document there. So that's kind of a quick example of the difference between inline that we covered earlier in the slides. Now, while we're on strong, we have to talk about its oft used sibling tag, which is emphasis, and that's EM. So I'm going to add an emphasis of the website, and I'm going to close the emphasis right after that and save. And EM adds emphasis, which in our case italicizes text. So strong does bold and emphasis does italics. All right, so far we've covered the header tag, paragraph, emphasis, strong tags. And in this video, we're going to be looking at list tags. Now I'm going to delete all of this content in my page just to keep this a little bit more tidy. I recommend you leave your code there and just continue on down afterwards, just keep going. But I'm going to delete that so it's a little bit easier to read. Now we're going to start out with the first list tag, which is the unordered list, so UL. Now we use this tag back in the example. So I'll open my unordered list tag and I'll close it. And then the first child here is what we call an LI tag, or a list item. And I'll just call this item 1. And I'll close the list item tag. And I'm going to add 3 of these list items. So item 2, and finally item 3. All right, now I'm going to just space this down, just close that. So you can see I've tabbed each of these over 1 tab space from where the UL started, because list item is child of UL. And UL is tabbed over one tab space from where the body starts because UL is child of body. So just try to get in that habit. Now I'm going to save this page and jump back to my web browser and refresh. And now you'll notice I've just got my 3 list items. And list items by default and an unordered list have bullets. So this creates a bulleted list is what that does. Now right below this, I'm going to leverage copy and paste because the next series of HTML tags that we're going to look at are the ordered list, and they're very similar. So I'm going to copy this entire list item, Command C, and come back down here below and Command V to paste. And the only difference between an ordered list and an unordered list is the parent tag here. Ordered is OL, so I have to open the OL and change this to a closing OL, while unordered is UL. So with an OL list, I'll save and refresh again, and you'll see that's just simply ordered. 1, 2, 3, etc. So that's an ordered list and an unordered list. Now, some people may be wondering, can I change the ordering here? And the answer to that is yes. Through CSS, you can change this to use alpha, A through Z, uppercase and lowercase. You can use Roman numerals. You can use the Greek alphabet. So there's several ways to order these lists besides just 1 through 9. Same thing goes for bullets. You can use solid circles, squares, open circles, open squares, and even custom check marks or something like that. You can use custom images for your list items through CSS if you choose as well. So many ways to style these lists. The third type of list is called a definition list. And let's look at the syntax for it. A definition list is a DL list. So I'm going to open the DL tag and I'll close the DL tag. So that's a definition list. And it has as children DD, which is a definition, and I'll close the DD, and I'll say web design, and then after that we have what we call a DL. So these ones are a little bit different, and this is the not DL, a DT, and this is the term definition. And let me save that one there. And I've actually got these two backwards. The definition term, which is the DT, comes before the definition. So an example of using a definition list might be like a glossary or something where you're defining terms. So I might just define the term as web design, and then the definition, which is DD, might be the art of mixing code and creativity. So the definition and the term. So let's save this list, jump back to our web browser and refresh. And you can see it just does an indentation. So there's the term and there's the definition. So those are the 3 types of lists: unordered list, ordered list, and definition lists. Definition lists are often used in terms and glossaries. Unordered lists are often used for just bulleted lists or navigation items. All right, for this tutorial, we're going to be looking at some of the semantics of tags and how those work. Now you'll recall we've been talking about block tags and inline tags, and we looked at a few examples of those. And I want to just quickly illustrate a few do's and don'ts of tags. One of the easiest ways to remember how you can use tags is that inline tags can only contain other inline tags. And you can't have an inline tag that's a container of a block level tag. For example, you recall before I had a paragraph. So I'll just do this up here. Whoops. And one of the rules of HTML actually while we're here is all tags must be lowercase. So don't ever do capitalized tags. So I'll say this is a paragraph, and I'll close the paragraph, and then I'll come into these words and I'll add that strong, which again is bolding the text. So here the paragraph is the parent tag because it contains this child tag of strong, and this is semantic code because I would add strong, I would add this emphasis to the words, but the opposite is incorrect. I can't do strong outside of the paragraph tags and have this bold the entire line. It actually will work. I get a lot of students to say, well, it works, but it's incorrect still. So even though that entire paragraph is bold, you can't have a block level element inside of an inline element. So in order to do this correctly, I would actually have to put the strong tag inside of the paragraph. And then visually it's going to be the exact same, but now this code is semantically correct and it won't have any errors when you validate your web page. So you can kind of think of this logically. You're not bolding the paragraph, you're bolding the text inside of the paragraph. And same thing goes for header tags. A common mistake might be this. So let's show you this quick example. This is the correct way to do it. A header 1, this heading tag, close the header 1. So let's save and refresh. So I have a header followed by a paragraph. And I see occasionally students will take this header 1 and they'll put it inside of a paragraph like this and refresh. Now you can see it looks the same, but again, this is incorrect. This is semantically incorrect because heading tags are not inside of paragraphs. Rather, they precede the paragraph. So it's a heading, then a paragraph. So if you can kind of just think of that logically, how would you do a Word document or how does a newspaper flow? Well, headings don't go inside of paragraphs. Paragraphs are inside of headings. And the same thing if I was going to do a paragraph and then I wanted to have a bulleted list like this after my paragraph, I would not take that bulleted list and paste it inside of the paragraph. This is incorrect. The paragraph, then the bulleted list, followed by another paragraph. So this is semantically correct. So just kind of think of that logically and you should be okay. So that's the difference between those block and inline tags and how they should be used. And we want to look at just one more set of tags while we're in this video, and that's going to be the rest of the header tags. So I'm going to delete all of this code down all these different lists that we built. And there are 6 different heading tags. There's header 1, there's header 2, and then these go all the way through header 6. So I'm just going to copy this and paste this a few more times so I have 6, and I'll change all of these to H3, H4, H5, and H6, and 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we'll save this and refresh the page. And you can kind of see how those lay out. There's the header 1, 2 gets smaller, 3 smaller, all the way down to the heading 6. So each of these headings gradually gets smaller. And headings work like a newspaper. The main section of the newspaper should be the header 1. And if you have a sidebar column with a heading, that's going to be a header 2. Maybe you have tertiary headings, which are going to be header 3s. So these should be used according to the semantics as well. So a heading that's less important would be used inside of a header 3, where the main heading would be used for a header 1, and et cetera, et cetera. So those are the headings and a little bit about the semantics of the difference between block and inline tags. This section of tags we're going to be looking at are structural tags. And because we're working with HTML5, there are a whole bunch of new structural tags that were introduced in HTML5. So let's take a look at first the old tags that were used for structure, and then some of the new tags. So I'm going to delete all my code, so I'm just left with the blank body here again. And the primary tag that was used for web design for really the last 15 years has been the div tag. And div stands for division. So we open a div and we close a div, and then we have content inside of the div tag. Now the div tag by nature, if I save this and come back to my page and refresh, it just shows the words. So the div tag is kind of an invisible tag. You can't really see anything special about it. It just looks like words. And that's because it's a structural tag. It's a tag that's used to define structure and width and context to a page. You can see from this slide that some of the new structural tags in HTML5 allow us to better semantically define our website. So whereas before in HTML4 we would have used a div tag for every single one of these blue boxes. This would have been a div, this would have been a div, this would have been a div, div, div. But now with HTML5 we have dedicated tags that have some inherent meaning in them, like the header tag and the footer tag and the article tag, a nav tag for navigation, a side tag to designate an aside content like a sidebar or something similar. So we have these extra tags which just help define our structure of our web page a little bit better. Occasionally students will ask me, well, why should I use header instead of div if they do the exact same thing? And the reason is that for search engines and other internet robots, they don't know the difference between two divs, but they do know the difference between header and nav, for example. So they would better be able to structure your web page and be able to tell, oh, this section of code here is responsible for the navigation of the website. Whereas if it was just div and div, they might have to make an educated guess on what section contained your navigation. So by using these HTML5 tags, you better allow search engines and other similar bots to index and structurally present your code. So let's jump back here to our browser again. So div is one of the structural tags, and the header tag and those other HTML5 tags, they just go like this. They're just similar, but they're just header content. And another one is called the section tag. The section tag is another structural content tag. And these would just all make up particular sections of your website. Now let's save this and jump back here to our web browser and refresh. And you can see those just stack up on top of one another. They really don't do anything special by default. They just define structure to your code. In order to actually move these tags around so that it mimics this layout, so the aside is over here and the article is over here and they appear in this flow, I would use CSS. That's the power of CSS. Remember, it's responsible for the presentation, alignment, and style of objects. So in order to get my article this particular width and this thing to the side of this, I would use CSS to do all of those things. So HTML tags simply define the structure, whereas the CSS defines the presentation. So those are a few of the structural tags. We'll look at a couple more tags in the next video. All right, our next tag is going to be the link tag. We're going to look at the anchor tag, which is what it's called, and that's how you create web links. So I'm going to delete all of these structural tags we've been working with, and let's create the first link tag. Now the link tag is called an anchor tag, and it's simply A. And this tag is one of the tags that has our first set of attributes we're going to be looking at. So the first attribute is called href or href equals, and then I'm just going to leave a blank space or do a pound sign in here for now. And then I'll put the anchor text, and then I'll close the anchor tag. So again, here we have an attribute, href, and then equals, and then the value goes in between the quotes. So the value right now is just a pound sign, which is just really nothing. So let's save this and jump back to our web browser and refresh. And you can see that anchor tags or link tags turn blue by default, and they get underlined. And when I hover my mouse over them, I get this little mouse pointer. And when I click on the link, it should take me to wherever that link is supposed to. I did a pound sign, which is why it didn't go anywhere. This is an invalid link. But you can see one of the properties of link tags is as soon as you click them, by default, they turn purple, which means that I've already visited that link. So the anchor tag is how you define links. They can be links to web pages within your own website, or they can be links to external web pages on other websites. Now, before we get too much into the link tag, we've got to talk about this path inside of here, or the page that we're trying to link to. Now, the actual value inside of here is going to be one of two things. It's either going to be an absolute path, which means it's a complete web address like http://www.google.com, or it's going to be a relative path, which just means it's going to link to a page on your own website. Now, the difference between relative paths and absolute paths is really difficult to wrap your head around when you're starting out. Students seem to struggle the most with this topic, and it's kind of one of those things that once you get it, all of a sudden it makes sense. So I'll try to briefly explain the difference between a relative and an absolute path as it pertains to the web. It's a little bit more complex when you talk about relative paths on a file system, on a computer, like your C drive or something like that. But we'll kind of explain it in the context of the web. All right, to explain this, I'm going to type just a few notes here in the HTML, and this will be a good time to introduce what's known as an HTML comment. Occasionally, you may want to write a simple note inside of your source code to remind yourself what a particular section of code is supposed to do. And you can do that with HTML comments. And their syntax is a little bit goofy, but it's a angle bracket, exclamation point, and then 2 dashes, and then 2 dashes followed by the closing angle bracket. And then inside of here is a comment. And you can see how my particular text editor is making this entire line gray, which tells me it's a comment. Now, if I was to save this and come back and refresh my browser, notice how that comment line doesn't appear anywhere. It's not visually in my document, but it still is in my source code. There's my comment right there. So comments are a way that you can kind of add notes and comments to yourself inside of your source code. And I'm going to leverage that feature to just type a few notes here about relative and absolute paths. So I'm going to hit return here a couple times and tab down there. So everything in between these two things will be a comment. So you can think of, we're going to start out with absolute paths. Absolute paths are the easiest to understand, and they're like a address. We can think of a absolute path like a physical address to a house. An example on the web, or if we keep with this analogy, an example might be 123 Pennsylvania Avenue, or something like that. So that's a physical address, and it never changes, right? 123 Pennsylvania Avenue is always going to be there. And if I want to get to Pennsylvania Avenue from the United States or from Colorado, then I would follow a certain directions. If I want to get to Pennsylvania Avenue from the southern hemisphere, Mexico, I would follow a set of directions. But the address never changes. So that's like an absolute path. It's always the same. So on your computer, an example of this would be like C, if you're on Windows, / programs and files, users, Andrew, desktop, file.html. So this is an example. I'm going to tab that back once so it's all in one line. This would be an example of an absolute path. It's always the same. It never changes. And they always start with the furthermost back root folder. So in this case, it would be the C drive. They always kind of start with as far back as you can go. And if I want to open up this file, no matter where I'm at on my file system, on my computer, this is the address to that file. It doesn't change. Now, that's in opposition to relative paths. Relative paths are like directions to an address. So using this same example, if I wanted to get to this particular location, instead of typing in an address, I would follow directions like go north, then east, then on road, state road, blah, blah, blah. So it would be like the directions to the address. Okay. An example of that in code on your file system would be something that looks a little bit like this. It would be .. desktop / file.html. So this is a relative path to this address or this file or this location I'm trying to find. And just like absolute paths, they never change. Relative paths always change depending on your location. So, for example, if I'm in the Western United States, to get to this address, the directions are going to be different than if I'm in Mexico, right? So the path is always going to be different according to my location. So, for example, on the file system, if I'm currently working on the desktop and I need to access this file, the relative path will be a certain path. But if I'm in the programs directory and I need to access this file, the relative path will be different. Whereas with absolute, it's always the same because absolute always starts with the root directory. Now, if that didn't make a whole lot of sense, don't worry. It'll probably come to you as soon as you start working with web pages and paths. It'll kind of start to make a little bit more sense. But you really kind of have to understand the difference between an absolute and relative path when you're working on the web. So I'm going to delete all these comments, and now we'll kind of go back to our anchor tag, and we'll start off with an absolute path for an anchor tag. Now, when I say an absolute path on an anchor tag, I'm referring to an absolute URL. So something like http://www.google.com. So the entire web address to a web page is what the absolute path is. That never changes, right? So let's save this now, come back and refresh our web browser, and let's click on that anchor text. And it should take me to google.com. And it looks like it's trying to. There goes. Google.com is loaded up. So that path worked. And let's click back. Now, oftentimes when you use an absolute path, you want to make it open up in a new window or a new browser tab. In order to do that, we need to add another attribute and another value, which is target equals underscore blank. And this is a little bit weird. This actually comes from the days of frames in HTML. But this particular attribute and value will make it so that when I visit that link, so I'm going to save and refresh. When I visit this link, it actually opens up a brand new tab. You can see that. I have a brand new tab, and my old page is still here. So that's kind of what that anchor tag does with target underscore blank. And I would say as a rule of thumb, anytime you link to a website other than your own, you'll always want to put this target equals underscore blank. That way, if the user happens to close that particular tab, they're right back on your website instead of getting lost and not remembering where they were at. All right, so now that we've covered the absolute path, which is probably the easiest, we're going to target relative paths next, which are much more difficult. Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to be covering the relative paths for anchor tags. And just a quick note, anchor tags are not the only tag that uses paths, such as relative and absolute paths. Image tags and many other tags inside of HTML use these paths. So it's kind of something you can't avoid. You need to wrap your head around eventually. So I've got myself here a link that uses an absolute path, and I'm going to create another tag right here below this one. And this one is going to use an relative path. So right now I'm just going to do a £, and I'll say a relative link here, and we'll close that anchor tag, and let's save and refresh and make sure this is working fine on our browser. And right off the bat, you should notice something about the anchor tag. You should be able to tell me if it's block or inline, and obviously it's an inline tag because they're not stacking on top of each other, they're stacking left and right. So the anchor tag's an inline tag. So there's my relative link. Obviously, it doesn't go anywhere because I just put the £. So in order to illustrate a relative link, we actually have to have another file to link to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another HTML file so that we can link to this. So we're going to create maybe page 2 of our website. So in order to do that simply, I'm just going to highlight all of this web code and copy it, Control-C or Command-C. And create a new document. So I'm going to do File New. And I'm just going to paste all that. So Command-V to paste all that code. So there's all the source code. Now it's appearing all white in my particular text editor because I haven't saved it yet. So as soon as I save this as an HTML file, it will apply the syntax highlighting. So I'm going to save this file as page-2.html. And I'm just going to save it to my desktop, same place my other file is. So I'll click Save there. And let's come back to my desktop just so you can see I have now page 1 and page 2 side by side. And I want to create a link from page 1 to page 2. So I need to make page 2, which I have open right now, a little bit different. So I'll change the title. I'll say this is page 2. And I'm going to delete these links. And I'll just put a header 1 that says this is page 2. And I'll close that header 1. Okay, now I'm going to save this. And then I'm going to come back to my desktop and load up page 2 inside of my web browser. So I'll right click it, say open with Safari, and I can see here's page 2. this is page 1. And what I want to happen is when I click on this link, it should take me to this page. So I'm going to close both of these down and jump back to my text editor to make that link happen. Now we're going to use a relative link. So I need to open back up my page, my index page. So I'm going to say File, Open, and I'll select that index file and open that one up. So here's my index file. And I need to fix the link. So make sure you're editing your index file. And the link to get to my relative page is just simply the page name in this instance. So it's going to be page-2.html. Okay, so let's save that and come back to our web browser. And let's open up our index page in our web browser if you don't already have it opened up. And let's try the link. So when I click this link now, sure enough, it loaded up page 2. So that link is working. I can click back and try that link again. And that's a relative link. So I linked directly to a page. Now, I only had to reference the name of the file because these two files are in the same location. They're both on my desktop. Now, if this is not the case, then relative paths change a little bit. So I'm going to demonstrate how this works with a quick example here. So I'm going to create a new folder. And I'll just call this my site. And I'm going to place this page 2 inside of my site folder. So again, this is on the desktop. I have my site. And now that page is inside of a folder. Now, if I just go back to my website or back to this index page and try that link now, I'm going to get an error, page not found, which means this file no longer, it doesn't know, it's not on the desktop anymore. So this link, this relative path is broken. So whenever you reference forward or you're going into folders, you need to put the folder name first. So I would have to say my site slash, whoops, I can't have that /. That won't work on a local site. So I have to have the name of the folder, then a slash, then the name of the file. So what this is saying is go into the folder, then, whoops, I accidentally deleted that, then reference the file. So let's save and refresh now. So I'm going to go back, reload the page, make sure you reload, and let's try this link again. And now it actually loads that page back up. And you can look up here and look at the URL in your address bar. It's going into my site and then to page 2. So that works just fine. But if I was to take this and move it back to the desktop, that link would be broken. I would need to go in and fix that. So to reference forward or inside of folders going forward, you just do the directory name followed by the page. Now, just to add a little bit more complication to this, so let's say that I have another folder inside of my site. So I'll just say another, and then let's say this page exists inside of that folder. So I have my index on my desktop, my site, and then in fact, if we pull these side by side, it'll make a little more sense. And then another, and then page 2. So to do that, it's just the same. First, I have to go into my site. Then I have to go into another, then page 2. So this would be the correct path for that. You always start with wherever the file you're working on, in this case index.html, is located. So index.html is located on the desktop, so that's where I start. I need to go into my site, into another, and then reference the page. So that's how that is. Now, if this index.html page was inside of the My Site folder, or in other words, right here, I wouldn't need to go into My Site because I would already be there. I would just simply need to say another / page2.html. So that's how relative paths work going forward. Now, it's a little bit different when relative paths go backward. And I'll show you the syntax for that in this example. So in order to make this work, we need to come back to our desktop, and let's say I want to create a link on my page2.html page that takes me back to the home page. So I'm going to right click this and say open with, and we'll open back up our text editor. And let's create an anchor tag. So a, then the property value of href equals, I'll put a £sign for now. I'll say for the anchor text, take me back home, and close the anchor tag. Save, and let's open this page up in our browser to make sure that link is there. So when I click this, I want it to go back to the home page. Now, because this folder is inside several folders, I don't need to go forward, meaning right. I need to go backward, meaning left. So I need to go back to another, then back to my site, then back to the desktop, and that's where that file is located. So again, relative paths are like directions. The directions have changed because they're always relative to the file you're currently working on. And in this case, I'm currently working on page 2. So how do I get to the index from page 2? Well, I have to go backwards several folders to get to it. And to go backwards in HTML or in path syntax, it's ... What that does is that takes me back one directory. So if I was just to say ... that would take me from the spot I currently am back a directory. So it would take me back. And then if I was to do another ... that takes me back one more directory. So I'm currently inside of another. So ... takes me back to my site. And then ... takes me back to the desktop. Now, once I'm on the desktop, this would place me on the desktop. I simply reference the file I'm after, which in this case is index.html. So I'll save that. And let's go back and refresh this. And let's try this link now. So this should take me back to index, and it actually does. It works. I'm back to index. This should take me... Oh, this link is broken. So I haven't updated that link yet. So I need to come back and fix the link for the index page, because I moved this inside of a folder called another, and I didn't update that. So let's see, we need to open up the index page. Whoops, not in a browser. We need to say open with and open it in our text editor. So again, this one goes through my site, another, page 2. Actually, that looks correct. Let's see what's wrong. I'm not sure. Let's try that link again. Maybe I didn't refresh. That worked. That takes us back. Oh, I just had not refreshed. So it is in fact correct. So now I can go to page 2. I can go back to page 1 for the index page and back and forth. So that's a quick primer on relative and absolute paths. Again, this topic seems to quite confuse people when they're starting out, especially the relative paths, how to go forward, and then the syntax to go backwards if you need to, like we did in our other page. So there'll be a few links in the resources to where you can study additional topics on relative and absolute paths, but that's how you use them in conjunction with links to link to sites other than your own, like Google, or to link to sites that are your own sites, for example, your own additional web pages. So that's it for the relative and absolute paths, and we'll see you in the next video. Right, in this video, we're going to be looking at the image tag and how to load images onto a web page. And just like the anchor tag, they have several attributes and values associated with them, and they also have relative and absolute paths. So I'm going to delete here the anchor tags. And just before I do so, I want to mention we've introduced on this tag, this first link here has two attributes. So there's the target attribute and the href attribute. The anchor tag can actually have several. It has one called title and several other attributes. So this is definitely not an exhaustive list of all the attributes of the tags. In order to get the complete list, you would need to reference the W3C online or something similar, W3 Schools, or another web page that has all of the attributes that are available to tags. But this is just a sample of a couple. All right, let's delete this and let's look at an image tag. Having said that, we'll look at a few of the image tag, but again, we're not going to look at all of the attributes. So the image tag is img for image, and it's a self-closing tag. There is no close img tag like this. It's just a tag that self-closes just the same way as our meta tag does up here, so that metadata. So it just has a slash and then the closing angle bracket. And the first attribute of the image tag we'll look at is source. So image src equals source. The href in the anchor tag stands for hyperlink reference, and src stands for source. And again, this wants inside of here for the value a relative path or an absolute path. So first I'll show you how to do an absolute path. I've just browsed flickr.com and found some images that are in the Creative Commons, so the attribution. And this is a particular image that's in there. And I'll show you who did this one here in a second. I'll come back and pull this up. So this is by user Sergey, and there's the link to his profile right here. You can see there's the web address to him. He's just got this little flower here. And I'll use this as a quick example. So I've right-clicked this and said, open image in new tab, which gives me the actual address to the file. If you don't see this .jpeg or .png inside of your URL, then you don't have the actual address to the file. So this is the absolute path to this JPEG. So I'll copy that and I'll come back here to my web page and I'm just going to paste that link in. And you can see it pastes the entire link there. And I'll save this index.html file. And I'm going to close these down now and go open this inside of my browser. And you can see now I've loaded that image inside of my web page. And this is what's called hyperlinking, because I'm not linking to this file from my own web server. I'm linking to it directly on Flickr.com. So I'm actually, sorry, not hyperlinking, it's called hotlinking. I'm hotlinking this image from Flickr. So the image is being loaded directly from their servers onto my page. Now you need to check with the terms and service of whatever website you're trying to hotlink images from, because they may disallow it. So make sure that you check that. I just use this as a quick example of how to create a hotlink. Now this is a relative path, or sorry, this is an absolute path, and I'm going to show you how to do the same thing with a relative path. So in order to set this up, we need to set our document structure up a little bit differently. So I'm going to go back here to my desktop here. I'll close this down. And I'm going to place index inside of my site. And I'm going to open up my site. And instead of calling this folder another, I'm going to rename this folder. So I'll just write on a Mac. You can just hit enter. On a PC, you right click and say rename. And I'm going to call this images. And I'll pull out page 2 and I'm going to drop this image. I've downloaded a copy of this image directly on my hard drive here. And I'm just going to rename this image flower.jpg for now and drop it inside of the folder. So now I have images and then I have flower.jpg. So a little bit different structure. Inside of my site, I have my index page and my page 2, and then I have an images folder with that image. So because I've renamed these files and folders, all of my links will break. So if you still have all of your links from page 2 to page 1 like we were working on in the previous video, those of course are no longer going to work because we changed the names of the folders and the structure of the directory. So I'm going to go back into my index file here and let's open that up. Whoops, I opened that with Dreamweaver. I did not want to open that with Dreamweaver. Let's quit this Dreamweaver. Let's actually right click and say open with our TextMate, which is the program I'm using. Okay, so now we're going to build a relative path inside of here. So again, you always start with the file you're currently working on and ask yourself, where in relation to the file I'm working on is the file I'm trying to get to? So if we look at our directory structure, I'm working on index.html and I'm trying to get to a file inside of the images folder. So I need to go forward into images. So the first step is to type images/. Now that takes me into images, and then I can simply reference the file. So flower.jpg. And let's save that. And let's go back here and open this page now up in our web browser. And you can see that that file loads up just like it did before. This time it's using a relative path. If I was to view the page source code, this is a relative path, not an absolute path. So that's the difference between the two. That's how you can load an image with a relative path. Now the image tag has two required attributes. The first we've already used here, which is source. The second one is called alt, A-L-T. The alt tag is just a simple description of what the image is about. So I might just say a red flower. Something that simple would work. And the alt tag is used for accessibility. If somebody was using this page on a screen reader or something similar to that, where a blind user was not able to see the picture of the flower, the screen reader would read them the words red flower, so they knew what this image was about. Also, if the image for some reason was not able to load from the server, if the server had a hiccup and couldn't deliver the image to the website, the web browser would display the text red flower instead, so the user would know, oh, there's supposed to be a picture of a red flower. The third reason why these are very important is for search engines. Search engines can't tell that this image happens to be an image of a red flower. So we give it an alt tag so the search engines can crawl my page and say, oh, this is an image of a red flower. So if somebody goes to Bing or Google Images and does an image search and types in the word red flower, then they would likely display this image in their results because of this alt tag. So lots of important reasons, and it is a required attribute of the image tag. So both the source and the alt have to be present in all image tags. The alt tag, you can see if I refresh, it's not shown anywhere by default. It's only used by those screen readers or if the image can't load. A couple of other properties of the image tag while we're here. One is width. So I can say width equals, and then I can put the number of pixels. So I can say like 200 pixels. And if I save that and come back and refresh, that constrains the width of this image to 200 pixels. Now, you may say, oh great, well that works great. I can resize my images however I want. But that's very, very bad practice. You never want to resize your images down using the width attribute. The reason being is that you're downloading a much larger file and only displaying it at a small size. So you're wasting bandwidth and making your website load slower for no reason. So you always want to make this image appear at the width that it is. So if my image is going to be this big on my web page, you would need to resize the image to this size in Photoshop before you actually put it on the page. And just like width, there's one called height. So I can say height equals 100, and you'll see what happens here. I'm actually squashing and stretching the image out because I'm making it 100 by 200. So you would definitely want to make these values the same height and width of the actual image size. On this particular Safari browser, if I right click it and say open a new tab, it'll tell me the actual size. This is 333 by 500 pixels. So I know that the image size from doing that. You can also look at the properties of the image inside of Photoshop, or you can right click it and say inspect properties, or many ways to find out the image size. Now, the reason why this image size is useful is that it'll help your web page layout. So when a user visits your web page for the first time, if you have a whole bunch of images all over your page, they haven't downloaded from the server yet. But if you put width and height values in there, the web browser will block out a big space where that image is supposed to go, and then as it's downloaded, it'll simply fill in that space. Whereas if you didn't put width and height, as the image starts to download, all the elements on your page might shift down or to the right and to the left because that image finally loaded and had to shift all the content around it. So your web page will kind of jump and shift a little bit, whereas if you put the width and height attributes inside of your images, then your web page won't shift and jump as those images are downloading. So those are a few of the reasons to use width and heights inside of the image tag, and that's how you use the absolute and relative paths for loading images. All right, in this series, we're going to be looking at tables and building HTML tables. Now, HTML tables used to be the de facto standard of how web designers used to lay out complex websites. Back in the late 90s and even the early 2000s, web browsers really didn't have a standard way of rendering CSS and HTML as it should have done. And so designers relied on using tables to do these layouts for multi-columns and headers and footers and things like that for web layout and web design, which worked, but actually introduced a whole bunch of other problems along the way. So the web design community has definitely since moved past table design, and we design all of our elements using proper HTML and CSS tags, and now the new HTML5 tags. But tables are still used in web design, but they are used for what they were initially intended for, and that's tabular data. And so I'm going to show you how to build a few simple tables and how to do a simple Colspan and Rowspan to merge cells inside of a table. So let's go ahead and get started. There's quite a bit of code involved in tables, so we'll break this into several video tutorials. Now the first tag to start a table is just table. So you open a table tag and you close a table tag. And the table tag has quite a few properties and values, and lots are deprecated, meaning they're no longer used. So you definitely have to look up in the official documentation resources of w3c.com or w3c.org to find out which attributes are allowed and which ones are not allowed in which versions of HTML, because they've kind of gone back and forth on a few of these. But one tag that's very important is the border tag. So we're going to say border equals 1. So the border attribute we set to 1, which basically means a 1 pixel border. Now it's actually not 1 pixel, it's more like 1 unit. You can kind of think of it as 1 pixel because web browsers, you'll see in a second, render these borders a little bit differently according to the browser. So I'll say table border equals 1, and the table tag is made up of rows and columns. And so let's quickly look at a simple PowerPoint that'll help us illustrate this. Right, as you can see here in this slide, this is a typical HTML table. Now the top row is colored a little bit differently. It's darker to indicate that this is the table header. This particular table is made up of 3 rows. So I have row 1, row 2, and row 3, and then 3 columns, 1, 2, 3, which brings us to have 9 cells. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's 9 cells in this table. Now tables, just like it, is kind of like an Excel sheet. You can think of it maybe like that. And the first row or the topmost row of a table is typically the table header. And each of these cells are what we call TH tags, and they represent the header tags. And the next tag here are the actual rows. So this table happens to have 3 rows, a row being the entire horizontal space. There's 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows. And then each row inside of a table is made up of TDs or THs if it's the first row. But typically every other row after the first row are made up of TD tags, which stands for table data cell tags. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 TD tags, 3 TH tags, and then 3 separate table row tags in this particular table. So this is kind of how HTML tables are laid out. You'll notice that this table has TRs for table row, that there's no such thing as TC for a column tag. Columns are just made up when you have a row with multiple table data cells. So multiple rows with multiple TDs make up naturally the columns. So at a later date, after we get through these few basics of table rows and columns, we'll learn how we can merge 2 cells together, just like we can in Excel. So let's jump back to our table we've been working on and build a similar table to this with code. We're at this point to where we have our table tags in place, and we need to build a table with the first row. So we'll do a table row, and let's do a table data cell. We need to close that table row first. Forgot to do that. You want to get in that habit. And then we'll do this table data cell, and we'll close the table data cell. And let's just put, well, since this is the first row, this should be TH instead of TD, because this is going to be the header row. So I'll say col1, and I'm just going to take this code right here and paste it 3 times. Call this col2 and col3. So right now I have a row, a table, which has 1 row with 3 table header cells. And let's save and refresh this and see what this looks like inside of our browser. So let's refresh our browser here, and you can see that we have col1, col2, and col3. So I have the 1 row, with this is the header row. So let's go ahead and add the 2 other rows of actual data. So we'll need to do another TR tag because we're starting a new row. We'll close that table row off. We'll come up in here and we'll add 3 table data cell tags. I'm just going to call this one 1. I'll close that TD. Let's call this one 2. And we'll do 1 more and call this one 3. And let's save and refresh. And sure enough, there's my second row with 3 cells. And I'm just going to copy and paste this entire thing and paste it right below here. And we'll call this 4, 5, and 6. So again, we have now a table that has really 9 cells. These 3 are header cells, and these 6 down here are content cells. So I have my header, and then I have my content. Now, tables have 2 additional tags. Whenever you have a header row, a lot of times you'll encapsulate that in what's called t-head. So there's this t-head tag, and then when you have your contents, those are enclosed in what's called a t-body tag. So I'll do t-body, and then the t-body should be closed after all of the contents for the body. And then technically, since table row is a child of table head, we should take all of this code and tab it 1 space over. And in TextMate, if you hold down Command and the right bracket symbol, it'll tab over whatever code you have highlighted. So I'm going to highlight all of this. In Dreamweaver, you can just highlight the code and press Tab. Other text editors will probably have their own method of tabbing over a multi-lines in one swoop there. So this is now correctly nested, and all of our code is indented correctly, and we have a simple table with 3 rows and 3 columns. So in the next video, we're going to look at several of the attributes of table tags. All right, let's add some additional attributes to this table tag and look at how they affect our tabular data. So the first one we're going to look at is an attribute called cell padding. So we're going to say cell padding equals, and let's just set this to 10, 10 being 10 pixels. Actually, I'm going to set this to 20 to over-exaggerate it a little bit so you can see the effect. So I'll set it to 20, I'll come back to my web browser, and watch what happens when I refresh this page. So you can see that now there's 20 pixels of padding around each cell, which is kind of this invisible cushion. So the contents have 20 pixels around them on all sides. That's what cell padding does. And you can see there's a slight, a bigger gap in here between the header row and the contents of the table. Another similar tag to cell padding, or similar attribute rather, is called cell spacing. And it does basically the same thing. I'll set this one to 10 as cell padding, except it's the space in between the cells. So when I refresh here, you'll be able to see that. So cell spacing affects that space in between each one of these individual cells. That's what cell padding and cell spacing do. And we can also set a height and a width to our table. So let's set this width equal to 6, actually let's do 500 pixels and save. And let's jump back to our browser and refresh here. And you can see now that refreshes this so that the entire table is 500 pixels wide. Now I'm actually zoomed in a little bit here in my browser. You can see that. So if I was all the way back at 100%, it might be slightly different than yours. But so that width value is the overall width of the table. Now something interesting about tables is they kind of automatically stretch and shrink the columns according to the content. So if I was to have this column 1 and with more stuff, let's save and refresh this, you can see that it automatically grows to accommodate the additional content, and these other 2 columns automatically shrink. But the overall width is still 400 pixels. So they'll kind of auto-adjust themselves according to the contents of their individual cells, which is kind of a nice feature of these tables. Now, controlling the tables beyond this, we're probably going to want to move into CSS. If I want to control the height of individual rows or the width of individual cells, you would need to use CSS to control some of those properties. There are properties which are just like these widths and heights up here. You used to be able to come to a table data cell like cell 1 here and say height equals, let's say 200 for 200 pixels. Let's save that and refresh. And you can see that makes that particular data cell 200, which also affects the entire row. Now height and width are deprecated tags now on the TD tag, meaning they're not supposed to be used anymore on the table data cell. CSS has kind of taken over the responsibility of assigning widths and heights to your table. But it still is valid to use on the table tag. You just can't use width and height on the TD tag. Now it gets a little bit confusing because there's a couple of additional properties here which I'll mention. One of them is align. So I can come up here to my table and I can say align equals right. And if I save and refresh, this is going to take this table and align it to the right side of the page. Now, this, however, is a deprecated tag. You are not allowed to use align equals right on the table tag. So it's deprecated. And again, CSS is supposed to take responsibility of doing that these days. However, on the table data cell tag in XHTML, align is perfectly valid. So I'm going to show you an example of what align does on the table data cell tags. So I'm going to take up here and I'm going to add a height to my table of 500 as well. Come back and save and refresh. And this particular table, in order to illustrate how this works, I actually need to add height on this particular row. So I'm going to add a height of 200 again. Again, that's deprecated, but this will illustrate how the align property works. So I'm going to come in here to this first data cell. So TD, where the first one is, and I'm going to add align equals right. And what this does is it aligns the contents of the cell to the right side of the cell. So for align, I can either say left, you can kind of see what that does. I can say center, that's going to center the content, or right, we'll put it on the right side. You can also vertically align content using the property v-align. So v-align, I can say top, and that will stick it at the top. Middle puts it in the middle where it was, the default is middle. Or you can say bottom, and that'll put it down on the bottom. So that's how you can align things. So if I want this to be in the bottom right, I would v-align bottom and align equals right. And that would stick the contents of the cell clear down there. And you can do that for each one of the table data cell tags if you needed to align them in a particular way. So again, that's kind of a useful feature when you're building your tables to be able to align rows or columns to the left and the right. You can also do this with CSS. And so it might be a little bit easier to do with CSS, but I just wanted to show you how you can align particular elements inside of a TD tag to one or the other. In the next tutorial, we'll look at merging. Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to look at merging cells inside of a table. And this is probably one of the more complex things you'll do inside of a table. And so I'm going to get my table back to the way I started with it. So I'm going to delete these alignment properties on this table. And I'll bring this column, I'll just leave that a little bit wider. That'll help to illustrate how this will work. So let's go back here and refresh. So we've just got our basic table. We have the table header up here and we have these rows down here. So let's say that maybe I wanted to align 3 and 6. What if I wanted to merge these two together so they were just one big cell? Now, in order to do that, we have to do what's called span the row. And there's two types of spans in tables. I can either do a row span or I can do a col span. Now, students will often get tripped up on the difference between these two, and I think initially everyone guesses the opposite of the way it actually is. If I was going to merge cells 3 and cell 6, I would ask you, what type of merge would that be? Is that a row span or a col span? And students often get confused and they say, well, it's a col span because I'm in column 3. But that's incorrect because I'm merging two rows together. So I'm merging row 2 and row 3. So when I unite these two cells together, that's actually a row span because I'm spanning two separate rows. So make sure you kind of make that distinction there. So there's kind of a method I've come up with which I think helps merging these cells. And the first thing is you go to the cell you want to start the merge in. And it's always what I suggest is it's the top cell or the leftmost cell. So you kind of work your way from top left down to bottom right. So in this case, cell 3 would merge in to cell 6. So I come into the merging cell, which is cell 3, and I come into that table data cell, and I start with the span. Again, this is a row span. So I say row span equals, and then inside of here for the value for this attribute, it's the number of rows that this is going to span. In our case, it's going to be 2 because I'm spanning 2 rows. So 3 is going to go into 6. So you do the row span, and then the very important thing is you don't save and you don't refresh. If I was to do that, you can see the entire table breaks and it will be very difficult to track down where your errors are if you have a complex table. So don't do that. Instead, I'm going to undo that and save and refresh. Instead, what you need to do is you need to add the row span like I just did, row span equals 2. And then you find the cell that 3 merges into, which is in our case 6. We're back here in our picture, 3 goes into 6. You find 6 and delete it because it's no longer needed. 3 is going to merge into it. Then you save, then you refresh. Okay, and you can see now that is a complete merged cell. And that is a row span again. So let's say, well, what if I want cells 1 to merge into cell 2? Now what type of span that is? That's a call span because I'm spanning 2 columns. So I would start with the leftmost cell or the top. In this case, it's 1. So I would go find 1. 1's right here. Come inside of the table data cell tag, and let's add a call span equals, and then it's the number of columns I'm trying to span. In this case, I want to span columns 1 and columns 2. So the number here is going to be 2. Now again, don't refresh because 1 goes into 2, so you find cell 2 and delete it. So I come find cell 2 and I delete it out of my code, save, then refresh. And you can see now cell 1 has merged into cell 2. And that's pretty fancy. So that's the basics of merging rows and columns inside of tables. It can definitely get quite a bit more complex for tables, but when you're building your HTML tables, in a real life website, you probably won't have a whole lot of row spans and call spans. It's typically just a list of data with rows, like a CD playlist where you have title, artist, duration, and then just a whole bunch of the data in the table. And so that's the basics if you do need to merge cells and rows. Now, some programs will have automated systems to where you can just build tables visually, like Dreamweaver and other text editors will let you just insert tables so you don't have to merge them and remember all those rules. That's the basics of it. Just to finish this off, let's say I decided at a later date I wanted cells 1 to merge all the way into cell 3 so that this merged all the way across. So we would come into cell 1, and now that's no longer going to merge 2 columns, it's going to merge 3 columns, and it's going to go all the way into cell 3. Now the problem here is if I just come and delete cell 3 and save and refresh, I have this hole down here. I've broken that. And so what we need to do, I just undid that. I would need to fix cell 3 as well. And so in order to do this, it gets a little bit tricky because I need to add another column down here. So I would need to delete this out of the second row, coming down into the third row, and add another column because it needs to have 3 columns. So I need to add one down there and call that one 6. Then save and refresh, and now that's back to its correct form. You're not allowed to have rows or columns with just these empty holes. It kind of will tend to break things. So that's the basis of the tables and merging rows and columns. All right, in this set of video tutorials, we're going to be covering web forms. And this could bring anything from a login form to a secure credit card, e-commerce form, an upload form, a contact form. So web forms are used quite often on the web to exchange data between websites and do all sorts of things. So we're going to look at the basics of building some web forms, and they happen to be some of the more difficult of HTML tags that there are. Web forms tend to have a lot of properties and a lot of attributes and values, and they're quite complex, and there's quite a bit to them. So we're going to tackle web forms here in the next few videos. And so here we go. The web forms start with the tag that is just simply called form. So we open a form tag and we close a form tag. Now the form tag itself has a lot of properties and attributes. So let's look at a few of those. The first one we're going to do is called action. We're going to say action equals, and inside of here I'm just going to put a pound sign for now. But this action equals is just like the relative and absolute paths for the image and link tags we looked at before. This is going to be the path to a file that processes the data when the user submits the form. So HTML and CSS only display the form. Once the user clicks submit, that data is gone really, unless you submit it to a page that actually takes the data and emails it or puts it in a database or charges the credit card or logs a user in. So the processing of the data in the form is much beyond the scope of this series here, but we'll get into that in the more advanced series when we talk about PHP and programming languages. For now, we're just going to leave this action as this pound sign, but just know this will eventually be the processing script. All right, the next attribute of the form tags is going to be method. So let's say method equals, and you have two options inside of here with forms. It can either be get or post. And we'll talk about the differences between those two once we actually build our entire form and understand a little bit more. For right now, I'm going to set it to get. If you don't know which one to use, I would highly recommend you set it to post. Unless you know you specifically need get, then always use post. For right now, I'm going to leave it on get. The next attribute here is going to be name. So name equals, and this is just simply the name of the form. This can be whatever I want. I'm just going to call it sample form. So again, this is just an arbitrary name that I've made up here to uniquely identify this form in case I had multiple forms on the same page. And the last part we're going to do here is going to be called inst type. And we're going to set that equal to multi-part rather, / form dash data. Now that's a little bit of a tricky one there, but what this enables the form to do is to upload files and to submit files. It could be pictures, JPEGs, Word docs, Excel documents, PDF, anything. So by adding this inside of the form tag, we've now enabled essentially this form element to be able to upload files, which we'll look at in a later tag. So that's the basics of the attributes of the form tag. There are a few more that can go in here, but that's the essential ones. And so let's go ahead and start out with our first actual form element. So inside of here, we're going to add the tag input type equals text. And we're going to say name equals. And then for the name value here, we're going to set this equal to just client name. So we'll just say client name. And input tags are just like the image tag and the meta tag up here. They're self-closing tags. So they don't have a closing input, they self-close. So let's just leave this much and let's save this page. And let's open up this form page in our web browser to see what it looks like. So let's double click our forms. I've created a new document here, a new HTML page for this forms. You'll probably want to do the same thing because there's going to be quite a bit of code here. You can see here that I've just got my single input field. I can type data in here, but there's no way to submit this. It doesn't tell me what's supposed to go in here, but at least I have my first input field. So let's jump back here to our code. And in order to tell the user what they need to put in to this field, we need to add a label. So right above this, I'm going to add a tag, which is the label tag. So I'll say label for equals. And this value of the for attribute should match the value of the name attribute. So I'm going to copy that, paste that right in there. I'll tell you what that does in just a second. And we're just going to say name. And then we'll close the label tag. Let's do name : space. So let's save that and come back here and refresh. And you can see that label adds the label here to tell the user that they're supposed to type in their name. So we would type in the name. Now, what that label does, the reason why we added for equals client name, that actually enables the user to do this action. So they can click here and type, or they can actually click on the name here and it will insert the cursor directly over here. Now, this is only going to work if I have an ID equals, and we'll set this equal to client name as well. And we'll talk about IDs once we get into CSS. But once I have that in place, you can see I can click directly on name and actually inserts my cursor right there. So just a little bit of a bonus feature there, I suppose. Now I'm going to delete the ID because I'm not going to be using that for the rest of the time because we haven't talked about IDs quite yet. I don't want to introduce them into here. So I'll leave off the ID. I just wanted to demo kind of how that worked with the for equals. Okay, so we've got our first input field inside of here, and it's working great. So let's add another one directly below here. So we'll start out with our client name, and next maybe we want to have the person input their gender. So this will introduce a new HTML tag we haven't covered, which is the break tag, BR. And notice it's also a self-closing tag. It has this slash as well. And the break tag just introduces a blank line, and I'll show you what it would do before and after. So let's say I had some text right here, and I saved and refreshed here. That text just appears directly after the input field because input types are in line. But if I wanted this text to go down on this new line here, I can introduce a break tag in between those two tags, BR, and that's going to force that text down to this line. So that way I can build my form horizontally and not have it run all the way, or rather vertically and not have it run all the way horizontally across the page. So I'll introduce a break tag, and let's do our second one. So I'm going to introduce the gender. So we'll say gender, and let's do another break tag here. And after gender, we'll do a label. So this label is going to be a little bit different because we're actually going to do a radio button, what's called a radio button. So we'll say input type, whoops, I forgot my opening bracket there. Input type equals radio. And we're going to say name equals gender. And we're going to say value equals male. And then finally, after all that, we're going to say male. And I've actually missed my self-closing tag there. And then finally, we'll close off the label tag. Okay, so let's save this and refresh and see what that looks like in our browser. So now you can see it says gender male, and they can select male. But obviously, we need to add the other radio button in order for this form to work how it's supposed to. So I'm going to copy all of this code right here and paste it all directly below here. I'm going to introduce a break tag in between these two. So we'll put the break tag to make these labels go on separate lines and copy and paste there. And I'll just change male to female in both of these spots. Save and refresh. And now you can see I have gender male, and the user can now pick one or the other. That's the way radio buttons are supposed to work. If your radio button lets you choose both at the same time, it's broken. So you need to make sure that the name value, so gender and gender, this has to be the exact same for both radios. If I change this and put an S on the end and come back and refresh here, you can see now I can do this, which is definitely broken. You should never have a radio element that allows for multiple selections. It can only allow for one selection by its nature. So make sure that the name is the same, otherwise you'll run into that problem. Okay, we've got our radio button in place, and the next one we're going to do is a simple drop down. So we'll come back to our code, and let's add a drop down. And the drop down one is a little bit different. So here we have input type equals text. We have input type equals radio. And the next one is going to be slightly different. So again, we're going to separate this out with a break tag so that it forces it down on a new line. And let's add our label first. So we're going to say label for equals, and we'll just call this state. And say state and close our label. And then we're going to introduce this next tag. Now the drop-down menus are in a tag called select. So it's going to be select name equals state, and ID we can just set to state as well. Actually, I guess I'll leave the ID out. I mentioned I wasn't going to use those, so we'll leave that out. And we'll close our select. And then inside of the select menu is where we put the options inside of the drop-down. So they're called option, and it's option value equals, and I'll just say CA, and then the text goes inside of there, and we close the option. And I'm going to copy this line and paste it 4 times down there because we're going to have 4 options, and I'll just change each of these. We'll say California, maybe we'll say Arizona, and maybe we'll say New York. If I was going to support every state, I would in fact need to do this 50 times. And maybe we'll say Florida. So we'll just leave this simple with 4 options here. So I have my label for state, and then I have the drop-down menu, which is a select, and then inside of there I have 4 options. So let's save that, come back and refresh, and you can see now there's the state, and I have this drop-down menu to where I can pick any one of these items that I want. Except I spelled Florida wrong, I just noticed. Florida. Fix that. And I guess we'll stay consistent. I'll do colon space after each one of these labels so it's kind of the same throughout there. Okay, that's the a simple form. Now I want to add 2 more tags before we move on here. And these 2 tags are called field set and legend. And they help somewhat structure forms, because oftentimes I'm sure you filled out web forms on the web that are quite large and long, and you maybe have to put credit card details and billing details and shipping details. And so these 2 next tags will help us format these a little bit better. I'm just going to zoom my text out just a little bit so we can see all the content inside of here. And the tag is called a field set. So let's add the tag right here. It's called field set. And it has a tag called legend. So I'll just call this maybe personal details. And I'll close the legend tag. And then I'm going to close the field set tag after all of these form options. And once we refresh this, you'll be able to see exactly what this does. I'm going to take all of the code that's a child here and tab it over. Because now the parent tag is field set and all of these are children, so they should be tabbed over. And now let's save that, come back to our browser and refresh here. And you can see what that does. Looks like I actually have an error in there. What did I do? Let's see, there's my field set. Oh, I need to close the field set. I didn't actually put the closing field set. There we go. Save and refresh. And you can see it just adds this little border around the tag, or around rather the form elements. And then this part is the legend. It kind of sticks it right in the middle there. So that's what field set and legend do. And there is a really simple web form. Now in the next video, we're going to add a few more elements and we'll add our submit button. Okay, continuing on with our form, we're going to add a few more elements inside of this personal details section here. So let's jump back to our code. And I'm doing everything here by hand, but oftentimes it's easier to use a WYSIWYG editor to build forms because of their complexity. So let's add our next element. Now for this next one, we're actually going to add in a description. So this would be something like a comment field where people would enter a comment or a bigger text area for multi-line data input. And so the first thing is to add the label. So we're always going to add these. We'll say label for equals, and I'll just call this description. And then we'll say description here and close the label. And the next thing, I'm actually going to hit return a few times and scroll up to get this a little bit more centered so it's a little easier to read. So we're not quite down at the bottom. And let's add the text area. The tag here is actually called text area. So text area and then name equals description. And this has 2 additional attributes that we haven't seen thus far. One is called calls equals, and I'll just say 45. And rows, I'll just say 6. And then we simply close the text area. Okay, so let's save this and jump back and refresh here. And you can see that the text area adds this text area box right here. So it looks like actually something's broken because I click in here and it's jumping back to California, which it shouldn't be doing. And also, I forgot to put the break tag in between these two so that it jumps down. So let's fix those couple of issues. Let's add the break tag first. Save and refresh. Okay, that fixes that. Now we need to fix that label issue. And it looks like up here I forgot to close these labels. So I have an opening label tag right here. This right here should be a closing label tag. I have an opening label tag right here, and this one should be a closing label tag. So open and close, open, close, open, close. So that should fix that. Let's save and refresh there. And yeah, that is working now. And the only other problem I did is I actually added the break tag in the wrong spot. I was supposed to add that break tag back down here at the bottom before the label. So let's cut that out and paste that there. Control X and Control V. Save and refresh. Okay, so now that's working properly. Now to describe what these calls and rows attribute does, it's fairly self-explanatory, but if I set this to 12 and save and refresh, that's the amount of rows that are available in the text area. And the calls represents columns, or kind of the horizontal width. So if I set this to 85, it's going to be, whoops, gotta delete that and reload that. Whoops, let's try that again. Reload. There we go. So that calls value refers to the horizontal width and rows the vertical width. So I'm going to set those back to 45 and 6 and save. And refresh. Okay, so there's a good little portion of our form done. Let's add one more element to this top section before we move on to the submit button. And we're going to add another label down here. So I'm going to do another break tag, and we'll add a label. So label for equals, and we'll call this one upload. So this is going to be like an upload option. We'll say choose photo, and then we'll close the label tag, do a space here to keep it consistent, and we'll do another input type equals, and then this one's a little bit different. It's called file. Input type equals file, and name equals upload. Make that the same there, and make sure that self closes. And now let's save this and refresh. And you can see what this does. So it says choose photo, and depending on your operating system and your browser, it'll automatically put in this little choose file field for you. You don't have to do anything. You just click this and it launches your browser to where you can select a site or a file. I can choose an index page and select OK. And when I submit this form, it's actually going to upload this file along with the form. So again, you would need a script to process the data to do something with the file, but that's all you need to do to build the file upload portion into the web form. So that's it for this first section. In the next video, we'll finish off this form and talk a little bit about styling it. All right, we're going to add a few more form elements, which will cover the basics, and then we'll add a few finishing touches to this web form. So let's add another break here. I'll add a break tag. And this next set of form fields we'll put in another field set to kind of illustrate how you can use these field sets to separate your data. So we'll add a field set tag. I'll open it and close it right here. And inside of here, I'll add the legend tag. And maybe we'll call this subscription details or something. Okay, now inside of this field set, we'll add a couple more form elements. So let's do a break tag right here. Actually, I guess we don't need a break tag. We already did one right above right here. So we should just be able to add our tag. This one's going to be a checkbox type of field. So we're going to say input type equals checkbox, name equals, and maybe we'll call this one subscribe. And we actually need to get our label. Forgot about the label. So right above this, we'll add the label. So say label for equals subscribe, and subscribe, close the label, and let's save and refresh and see where we're at. So you can see that there's this other field set. Now, one of the issues here is I've got this field set down here inside of the other field set, which I probably don't want to. So let's go fix that. The reason I didn't notice that is because I hit return a bunch of times and to put this code down here. So I need to cut this out and delete all this empty space. And this is going to go below there. So we'll save and refresh that. Now that's down there on its own line. And we could probably use another break tag right before, in between these two. just to push those apart a little bit. And there's my subscribe checkbox. So they can either maybe subscribe to a newsletter or not. And that's how a checkbox works. You can have multiple checkboxes if you want. Just make sure they all have the same name if they're in a checkbox group. The difference between a radio button and a checkbox is radio buttons allow for one selection out of many options, where checkboxes allow for multiple selections out of multiple options. Okay, let's do another tag. We'll do a break tag here. And this next tag we're going to do is going to be a password if the user is going to maybe create a password for your site when they signed up or something. So we'll do a label. Now I'm going to get lazy now and just copy and paste here. And we'll call this one password and password. And this one is an input type equals password. And we'll just say name equals password. Save and refresh, and that's looking pretty good, except it looks like my legend is messed up. Let's see, where did that go? Oh, I did not close it. It needs a closing legend tag. You'll see I'll make little mistakes like this all the time, and that's really common. And that's why it's nice to use an editor like this that actually will highlight errors. Dreamweaver, even this program does, I just don't have them turned on. And some other programs that you use will actually highlight a line or put a little X over here if that line seems off to help you fix your errors as you're coding. So I would definitely leverage those features, but I kind of want to do everything by hand so you can kind of see how that works. So the password field, there it is now, and you can see it's just adds bullets when you type. Now, one important thing to know about the password fields, it's not actually secure. Just because there's bullets here doesn't mean it's secure. When you click submit, it takes whatever you typed in and just sends it across the internet in plain text. So if I type in Andrew and hit submit, it's just going to submit the words Andrew. So you need to make sure whenever you're doing sensitive data to always make sure you have the HTTPS and the little lock symbol up in your web browser to make sure that they're sending that data over a secure connection. All right, that's the way the password field works. We'll do one more type of input. So let's do another break tag here, and we'll do another label. Label 4 equals zip. And maybe we're going to have them enter in their zip code. And we'll do this one just to illustrate a few more of the attributes of the input tag. So input type equals, I'm just going to do a regular text, just like we did way up here with our first name, way up at the top here. Similar tag there. We'll call this one, name equals zip. And let's save and refresh. So there's the zip code, but maybe I happen to know that zip codes are a certain, you can either do the 9-digit or the 5-digit zip codes. And so one of the properties here inside of the input, one of the attributes is the ability to limit the amount of characters that are typed in. And that's done with this one called max length equals, and I can set that to 5, and that will only allow the user to type in 5 characters. You can kind of hear me typing. It won't let me type anything beyond 5. And another one here is called size. I can say size equals 5, and that sets the size or kind of the width of this input field to a certain width. And we can also control the width and size and style of all these things with CSS as well. But I just wanted to illustrate just a couple more of those attributes that are available on some of these tags that we haven't covered thus far. So let's make these consistent, do our colon space like we've been doing earlier. Save and refresh. Now this form is pretty much done. The only thing that's missing is the ability to submit. I can't submit all the data. I can type it all in and fill everything out, but I can't submit. So let's add in the last portion here of the form, which is our submit button. And it's pretty simple. It's just input type equals submit. And we can say value equals submit. Save and refresh. And that adds the submit button. And that's it. As soon as I click submit, I can now submit the form. Once this is in place, I'm good to go. If I don't want it to say submit, I can always say click me You can put whatever you want inside of the value here, and that will appear inside of the button on the web browser. So I'll just put that back to submit. And now this form would be considered complete. So again, let's review a couple of things, and we'll talk about the method in our next video. All right, now we just want to finish up these forms and talk about a few of the properties and how they behave. So we're going to look at this in specifics. We're going to look at this method equals get. So I'm going to leave this set to get for now, and I'll switch back to my web form and refresh the browser here. And I'm just going to fill it out. So I'll just say name Andrew, state, description, and we'll choose a file here. I'll just select this file we've been working on. And subscribe, password 123456, zip code 55555. Notice I can't do any more. Okay, so I fill out the form and I'm ready to hit submit. So let's press submit. And you can see that once I click submit, all of that form data is actually appended in the URL. So all that data is up here. Notice it says client name equals Andrew. And then there's this and sign. Gender equals male, and sign, state equals Arizona, and sign, description equals. So there's a few important things we want to note from this data. First is, where did these names come from? Client name, gender. These come directly from the name attribute of the form. So whatever it says name equals gender, the data that gets sent will be exactly what I typed in, gender. Notice this one says client name in camel casing. That's because it says name equals client name. Okay, the value that gets submitted, or the part after the equals sign, is whatever the user typed in the form. Okay, so this is called the variable, and this is called the value. And all that data is submitted in the form that way. One particular note of interest is this one right here. It says state equals AZ, but I selected from the dropdown, I selected Arizona. So why doesn't it say state equals Arizona? Well, that's because the thing that gets submitted is the value. And even though the label says Arizona, the value says AZ. So whatever you punch in right here is actually going to be submitted when the user selects that particular option. So pay attention to that. If you want the word Arizona submitted also, you need to have the word Arizona in the value portion. And the other thing to note in here, if let's scroll over a little bit, there's the file right there, the index.html. And if we scroll over, there's the password. Notice it's just 123456, as I mentioned in the previous video. It's not submitted encrypted or anything like that. It's just regular old plain text. But all of the data is stuck up here in the URL. The reason why it's up there is because this method is set to get. Okay, so I'm going to change this to post this time. And I'm going to go back and refresh here. And let's say name equals Andrew. I'll just kind of click this really fast. Punch in some data here. And we'll subscribe. And this time let's hit submit. So, whoops, actually I need to refresh that first, sorry. I didn't refresh the page to show you actually how that works. So, there we go. So I'm working with a blank page now. I had all that data up there still previously. So let's type this out again. And click submit. And notice it sent the data. This time it didn't stick it up in the URL. And that's the main difference between post and get, is post submits the data behind the scenes, where get submits the data up in the URL. Other than that, they do the exact same thing. They both submit the data to the final location. If you don't understand the difference between post and get, a really simple example that I can give you, other than getting into quite a bit of programming terminology and history on why post or get, is this simple example right here. So I'm going to go to google.com, which is really nothing more than a web page with a form on it. It has one input field. I type something in and hit submit. So I'll just type in Andrew here and Google for Andrew. And if I click search right here in Google's search bar, notice that all of that data is submitted up in the URL. So that should tell you one thing, that that Google is submitting this form via GET. And notice that this says up here, Q equals Andrew. That's just what I typed in. So Q stands for query equals Andrew. So I queried Google for the keyword Andrew. Now the reason they have all the data up here in the URL is because this allows me to maybe bookmark this page, or I can copy this and send this link to my friend, and all he has to do is just click on the link and it'll take him exactly to these same results. Whereas if they used post and I Googled for Andrew, it would still give me the results, but my URL would just say google.com because none of that data would be up here in the URL. So I wouldn't be able to bookmark it or come back to these same set of results. So that's maybe a simple example of when get and post are helpful. So that concludes the section on HTML forms. As you can see, there's quite a bit to them. They get a little bit messy. There's lots of properties and attributes and values, but they're very powerful, and they're the method of exchanging data across the web. All right, we finished off most of the HTML tags that we're going to need in order to build a website. We left off a few of the HTML5 form element tags. There's been quite a few new tags introduced for forms and some other tags that we just didn't look at in this introduction series, but we will cover when we start to build our website. The last major topic we need to understand for HTML in order to segue us into the CSS portion of this intro series is what's known as the box model. Now, the box model refers to a model which block tags in HTML behave and how they render. And so I'll quickly show you this slide to illustrate how the box renders out. Let's assume that the box that's going to be displayed in this slide is just a simple div tag for now. The box model first consists of a margin. Now, margin is an invisible space around the outside edges of the element. So it's kind of like a cushion on the outer edges. Inside of the margin is the border, and the border is visible or invisible. I can turn the border off, or I can turn the border on and give it a width and a height. Border comes inside of the margin. Inside of the border is what we call padding, and padding is another invisible cushion. So that's the cushion between the border and the actual width or content of the div. So again, there's the margin, which is the outer cushion. Padding is the inner cushion. Border is between the two. And then the contents, or the white, is just the natural width and height of the element, depending if it's block or inline, or how your page layout is rendering that element. Now, what's important to note is the way that the box model renders. And this is a little bit different between browsers. And this is actually one of the main points of, I guess we could call it confusion among the browsers in the early web design days, is Internet Explorer rendered the box model differently than Chrome and Safari and some of those Firefox and these other early browsers. And so there was quite a bit of difference on how your page would look between browser to browser because the box model was so differently rendered. So we'll look at what the CSS specification calls for and how the box model should be rendered. And in order to understand this, we have to divide up the sections. So down here, the black lines, this refers to the width of the margin. This is the width of the border. This is the width of the padding. And then in between here would be the width of the content. Now, these numbers that I'm going to throw up are not to scale. They're just for illustration purposes. But let's assume we have 40 pixels of margin assigned, and we have 15 pixels of border, and we have 20 pixels of padding. And let's assume that we assign 400 pixels of width. So the important thing to remember with the box model is if we assign all these values, not only are they on the left side, but come over here to the right, they're also assigned to the right. So we also have 40 here, and 15 here, and 20 here, and then 400 there. So make sure that you account for the left and right sides for the margin, border, and padding. Now, assuming we had these values, that would give us an overall width of 550 pixels. So outer margin to outer margin, which is really how much space this element would take up on screen, would be 550 pixels even though we set width equal to 400. So it's a little bit confusing because we would go in our CSS and we would assign width equals 400, and you would think, well, this element's going to be 400 pixels wide, but it's not, because we have to add the padding, the border, and the margin on the left and the right side to actually get the overall width that this element will take up. This is the way that the box model works, and this was a little bit of the confusion between the browsers in the early days and how this was rendered. So just make sure you understand this simple model here, and you'll be able to build your websites. So let's switch back over to our web browser, and I'll show you a practical example of the box model in code, and you'll be able to see a little bit better how that works. So I'm going to jump back to my browser. Now I have a web page set up with some CSS already in place up here and a little bit of HTML down here. So you don't need to worry about the CSS for now. Let's just focus on the HTML, and I'm going to tag that down a little bit so we can just isolate this element essentially. So right here I just have a single div on the page, and I've added some CSS to it so you can see this div. And if we switch over here to the web browser, this is what the box looks like. So I have a div, and it's got some content, and right now it has a border assigned to the div. And you can see that everything just kind of touches edge to edge to edge. So I'm going to slowly add in the portion here of the box model so you can see how it works. So I'll come to this div up in my CSS, and again, don't worry about this. We're getting into CSS in the next videos. So I'm going to come into this box, and I'm going to say padding. Actually, I'll start with margin. Margin, let's set to 20 pixels. So again, margin back from our PowerPoint is the outer area. So if we save that and go refresh our page, you can see now there's a 20 pixel cushion. Again, it's invisible, but it's pushing this element 20 pixels away from anything that would touch it otherwise. Now let's go back and add some padding. So we'll say padding, and let's say 10 pixels of padding. So again, back to our chart here, the padding is the inner cushion in between the margin and the content. So we'll come back to our web browser and refresh. And you can see that adds 10 pixels of cushion all the way around. It's a little bit easier if we highlight this text. You can see there's 10 pixels all the way around there. And that's what the padding is doing. And then the highlighted text just refers to the width of the element. So if I was to come into here and set a width on this element right now, I'll say width equals 300 pixels, and we'll save that and refresh. Now this element's 300 pixels wide. I'm way zoomed in, so that's obviously not to scale. But I have 20 plus, I don't know how much I set to the border. Let's look at that. The border, I believe, was 5 pixels. So I have 20 plus 5 plus 10. So there we're at 35 plus 300. So now we have 335 plus 10, 345 plus 5, 350 plus 20, 370. So really this box is taking up 370 pixels of screen space. And even though the width says 300. So just make sure you understand the box model and how that works, because the padding and margin and border values add to the width value that you explicitly declare. And then if I was to do another element directly after this, let's just go add another, I'll just add a span tag and say hello. Span tag does nothing by default. It's just a simple inline tag that's used for hooking with CSS. And I'll save that and refresh. And notice that it appears at the top like it's supposed to, but it's got that margin here, so it can't bump up against that because there's that 40 or 20 pixel margin here. So you can see kind of how the box, how that padding, margin, and border affected this div over here, but I don't have any of those properties assigned to this span, so it just appears right at the top where it normally would. And being inline, it appears on its own line. Had I done a div tag, let's add another div tag with this same ID just to illustrate this. So technically we can't have two IDs of the same name. We'll get to that when we get to CSS. You can see with the div tag, because they're block, it forces it down on its own line, and there's a 20 pixel margin on the bottom here, but there's also a 20 pixel margin on the top of this one, So there's actually 40 pixels between these two, and they're both covering the 360 or whatever it was we calculated earlier space horizontally. So that's how the box model works and how it's rendered. I would just kind of pause the video on this slide and kind of make sure you understand how those different attributes affect the overall width and height of the box. Now, if you've made it to the end of the video, you can see that we covered all the basics of HTML. But if you're kind of looking at where to go or how to keep pushing your career and knowledge further, there's several links on my channel, specifically in responsive web design and how to design responsive websites that flow on mobile, desktop, and tablet. So check out my video series on responsive web design. It's another lengthy video, but it'll get you started with the process of building a website that's fully responsive. Like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.